This is the continuation of the 2018 Wilderness lecture series. Thanks for being here tonight. I'm Joanna Campbell. I'm the Assistant Director of the Wilderness Institute. And just a quick reminder, so this is the theme of our lecture is the, let me make sure I get this right. It's The Rivers Will Run, celebrating 50 years of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So each of our speakers focuses on a past, present, or future issue regarding the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and this will continue through April 3rd. Tonight we have Dr. Alan Watson. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping details. So those of you who are taking this class for credit, your papers from Charles Ray will be delivered to you next week when Natalie is back. But please turn in your papers for Tim Palmer tonight after the lecture. And we ask that everyone stay for the entire lecture. It should end by 8:30 tonight. And speaking of next week's lecture, mark your calendars. For those of you who are visiting, our guest will be Michael Fiebig, who is the Associate Director of the Northern Rockies for American Rivers. And he'll be talking about the role stories play in our connection to rivers. So, our guest tonight, Dr. Alan Watson. No, he is not a magician from Australia. Though he's been mistaken for Jake the Snake a couple of times coming through customs in Portland, but he's not him either. Nor has he ever made a public appearance in professional wrestling. Alan is a scientist deeply rewarded by having the opportunity to study all things wild for his entire career. He is the research social scientist at the Aldo Leopold Research Institute on campus, and his salary is paid by the federal government. And he's adjunct faculty in the Department of Society and Conservation at the Franke College of Forestry and Conservation at UM. He's preparing to leave on his sixth, this is outrageous and amazing and wonderful, his sixth Fulbright assignment next month, where he's been asked to represent the people of the U.S. on environmental diplomacy missions to Russia, Finland, Brazil, Taiwan, and now China, in pursuit of world peace through better intercultural understanding and collaboration to protect the wildest places in these countries. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Watson.
How many of you know who Jake the Snake is? No one, I hope. Yeah, good. Twice I've been mistaken for Jake the Snake, somebody I've never heard of. And one of them was on a bus in Portland, and one of them was twice actually coming through customs, one in Portland, one in Los Angeles. There's a Twitter, it's like, Jake the Snake, Jake the Snake. Like, who in the heck? It's a professional wrestler, some old guy with braids, I don't know who he was. But how many of you were here last week for Tim Palmer? Most of you are here, you're in the class, okay. And the reason I ask is, Tim was really an advocate, and he was talking about the history of Wild and Scenic River advocacy, trying to explain what happened as conservationists. And he was certainly introducing you to the community. He showed some pictures, he dropped some names. I edited a paper that he published just this last year. And we tried to talk him out of some of those names because you guys don't know those people. And boy, he didn't know. I got to have those names in there. He really cared about those people, those smiling faces he showed you. And you could feel it last week that he was really motivated, excited about those people and their names. And, we kind of forgot some of them. But that community was important. Well, this week we're going to look at a different community, and that's the science community, because I'm a scientist, not a conservationist. I guess you can be both. But if he tried to lure you into the conservation activism last week, which he did a really good job, you can see the excitement and the enjoyment he's had and the knowledge he has about Wild and Scenic River designation. Well, I'm going to talk to you about this community of scientists in Wild and Scenic Rivers, and try to explain kind of where we are in the science of Wild and Scenic Rivers. And an hour and a half sounds a long time. I've already eaten up 5 to 10 minutes of it. But every topic I talk about tonight science topic we could do a lecture on easily, probably many times over. So it's kind of light, trying to explain to you about the science in wild and scenic rivers, and just building a science agenda and community. And by the end, I hope you'll talk to me some about these science issues. And you budding scientists, young scientists, or people interested in science, which of these things kind of interests you? Hope we get a conversation either at the end or afterwards, or come. My office is on campus. So I am at the Leopold Institute. How many people know where that is on campus? That sign's been gone for a while. We've just remodeled, and that sign's back up, but the stone and stuff isn't around it. But this is where I've worked for many years here on campus. And it's a federal institute, and you can see Department of Interior and Agriculture. And these agencies, the Forest Service, Park Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, and USGS. So Interior and Agriculture. And that institute has been an institute just since 1993. That we've been in that building, really. That was a former administrative building for federal offices here on campus. Before that, it was a credit union, I think, on campus, the University Credit Union, a long time ago. And before that, there was a log cabin. I used to know a guy that lived in a log cabin on that site when he first came as faculty to the university in the 1950s or something, a microbiologist. So people that's been around a while have seen that corner change a little bit over time, but we've been there quite a while. Before 1993, we were a Forest Service unit, not an interagency unit, part of the Rocky Mountain Research Station, headquartered, and we still are affiliated with that station in Fort Collins, Colorado. And before that, the Intermountain Range Experiment Station out of Ogden, Utah. So we've been here on campus since 1967. Actually, in 1967, there was a budget rider in Congress that added like $100,000 for a research unit to be here at the University of Montana. There's a really strong forestry dean. I think he was also president of the Wilderness Society at the time. And there's a guy who was the majority leader of the Senate. It wasn't Mitch McConnell back then. Who knows who is the majority leader of the Senate back then?
Metcalf?
Pardon?
Wasn't Metcalf?
No. It was, you got me confused. Mike Mansfield. But good friends with Metcalf. Metcalf actually went and said, asked him to put a rider in a budget to create a wilderness research unit here. Remember, the Wilderness Act was in 1964, and I remind you of that because Tim last week talked about how important the Wilderness Act was to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act in 1968. He talked about that relationship, how important that was, and it gives you an idea of what was going on in the United States at that point in time in terms of conservation. But we'll talk about it. There's a lot more going on at that point in time. But what I'm drawing from tonight, and this makes it easy because I'm not talking very much about my research. If I talk about my research, I'd talk mostly about wilderness. I talk about wilderness issues. I'm a wilderness scientist, have been. Are you ready for this? Today is my 30th anniversary of being on campus at the University of Montana. That shocks me. You just wake up one day. And you've been here for 30 years. I've done research in most wildernesses around the country, many countries around the world. I'm very honored to be a Fulbright scholar and specialist. I work with a lot of other countries and take this wilderness stuff we do and take it up to world peace level. And I get excited about that. And I could talk about that all night if you wanted me to sometime. But I'm going to not talk about wilderness very much, only a little, and talk about wild and scenic rivers because that's what they asked me to come talk about this time. Because just this last December, we put out an issue of a journal, the International Journal of Wilderness. We put out a special issue on the 50th anniversary of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So we've done it before, back in 2000, 2001. We did some theme issues, and that journal is kind of a mix of, there's some opinion pieces, there's some research, a lot of peer-reviewed research. There's education, there's international stuff going on in that journal. We started it in 1993, I think, so it's been around a while. People like me have been there the whole time sitting on the board of that thing. We need to move on at some point in time, but we keep trying. But I worked with a guy named Steve Chesterton, And I'm going to talk a lot about the federal agencies tonight. Don't hold that against me. I'm a federal agency scientist, but it's the federal agencies that manage these wild and scenic rivers. I'm sure some of you have aspirations or maybe nightmares about working for federal agencies, but they're very relevant in this discussion of wild and scenic rivers, and the science that we do is very relevant, obviously, to these wild and scenic rivers. But Steve is in the Washington office, in the Office of Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers. He's the National Wild River Coordinator for the U.S. Forest Service. So he's on the management side. I'm on the research side. So very separate branches within our agency. But we work together, and I just kind of show this slide and highlight in bold a few of the agencies, the articles in this sense of community that I'm trying to help you feel part of tonight. I want you to all be scientists with me and think about science. This could be a group of complete scientists, thinking about this issue. And actually, when I get into this science agenda, it's really a proposal that's being floated around the Washington office right now. I call it our $1 million idea. We would love to have initiate a research agenda related to rivers, and you're going to look at what we're proposing right now. So the Park Service, the BLM, Forest Service, University of Georgia, University of Arizona, Northern Arizona University, the International Institute of Tropical Forestry, Yunnan University in China, Czech Republic, and the University of Leeds in England. We have an international component to this journal, and it's not just this last December issue, but this next March we have some international papers there. Anyone here normally, quarterly read the International Journal of Wilderness? Is it available to you? We just found out the other day that the university canceled your subscription. We were like, what? We think of this as the flagship university in the country with students like you and graduate students and faculty doing research that's focused on things like wilderness and wild and scenic rivers. And the library canceled canceled the subscription the 1st of January last year. And I know it's a hard time at the University of Montana right now. We're reinstating that. I made a bunch of copies and sent them over to the library to bound them so that you would have access. And it's one that's everything except the last 3 years since 1993 is all accessed electronically. And if you're doing papers, if you're thinking about wilderness, this is where people around the world go to that journal. And this last December, like I said, this community got together, plus a whole bunch of people doing peer reviews from American Rivers and from other NGOs and university people doing reviews. And so it's that science I'm going to kind of talk about tonight. I want to put it in perspective a little bit. If you're here last week, which 95% of you it seemed like were, then you heard Tim Palmer, and we asked him to write a paper for that journal to give that history, not about science at all, just given that history. So everybody that reads that issue of the journal will know that history he talked about. And we also did a book review of his book. Sorry, I didn't bring any copies of the journal to sell tonight, but I've got some in my office. No, we don't sell those. He's very much in the history, and his I think back here it says A Legacy of Rivers is talking about his paper there on the front cover. And he talked about a legacy. He used that term last week some. I want to make sure you thought about that term. I'm going to try to put that term in perspective for you before we get into the science. And certainly a legacy is a bequest, an inheritance, an heritage, endowment, a gift. And let's think about it from the 60s, or think about it from 1968. And I know most of you weren't around at that point in time, and I'm very conscious of that. I have a 16-year-old daughter that a while back, the music was playing, it was 60s music, and I said, oh, do you and your friends like 60s music? Said, oh, some of my friends like 20th century music. It's like, whoa, Rick, we've never heard anybody call it 20th century music. My daughter was born in 2001. It's like, Alan, stop and think. Not everybody's been here on campus for 30 years, right? So I've been around a long time. So the way I relate to things and think about things are going to be different. The way you think about them or your understanding. But they're also different from other countries as well. And let's think about that before we talk internationally at all. Because what was happening in the 1960s, we think of the rights movements that we went through, civil rights, minority rights, voting rights, women's rights, animal rights, environmental rights. There's a whole bunch of things. Not only do we have, a lot of struggles in our country in terms of Vietnam, and we had, love and peace and drugs, and we had awareness of chemical impacts. There's a lot of things going that, you probably have classes on the 60s at the university, just like I studied Civil War or something. And what a time in our country. That rights movement was real important. And who was the Senate Majority Leader at that time? Don't you confuse me. Mike Mansfield. I'm going to say it before you say something else. So Mike Mansfield was the longest term Majority Leader in the Senate ever. Remember, Tim, the other day, what was the vote in the Senate on the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act? Unanimous. And I asked him about those 6 or 7 that voted against it in the House. I'd love to know who those were. We got to figure that out. It'd be a good assignment to get somebody to figure that out. He couldn't come up with it. I thought he'd have names for them, and know exactly who they were. But it was a time that we were really together, Democrat and Republican, on a lot of these rights issues. They were really strong, and like he said, for the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, the President Johnson was saying, what's the next thing? Well, we got this rivers thing. Let's go with it. It was a really important time, and the Clean Water and Clean Air Act going up into the early 1970s. So, let's realize that our country went through that time, and it's really influential, and it is a legacy. And a lot of people are looking at that legacy, and they don't necessarily understand it because they haven't lived through it. You haven't lived through it. You receive the benefits. You understand it. You're surely conscious. Your parents, grandparents talk about it. But it's certainly something that's important in our country. And if you're interested in the outdoors and policy, Wilderness, Wild and Scenic Rivers, Clean Water, Clean Air Act, this is who we are. And, Mike Mansfield playing a part of it, certainly those of us who live in Montana gives us we're right in there thinking about that and thanking for that legacy. So 1968 it passed, it's the 50th anniversary, and he mentioned yesterday, we're going to come back, last week, Tim Palmer talked about Montana having the 2 wild rivers, and I wanted to just touch base on one of those for a minute before we go on and talk about the science agenda. And he mentioned Idaho had 22. We're going to come back and look at that distribution and where those rivers are a little bit later as kind of a science issue. But he made it pretty clear last year that in 1976, the Flathead River, and I just wanted to show you that it's typical of the legislation that they would often add multiple rivers in one piece of legislation. He talked about the 25th anniversary, they were trying to have 25 rivers. He talked about park barrel, like pork barrel. If you can get one river, put a whole bunch of them together, and everybody will slap each other on the back and pass them, and build them. And we haven't been near as active for many years. We still only have the 2 in Montana. But this Flathead legislation, I dug it out earlier this week and was looking at it again. And it's pretty typical of that legislation where it kind of designates kind of multiple tributaries. And it distributes them across, what are the 3 categories of wild scenic rivers? Tim talked about them. Do you remember? Wild is one. What's the others? Recreational and scenic. So the Act says that they will be, and the Act gives those definitions. And on the Flathead, so it's interesting, it's not just a Flathead River, not just a stretch of the Flathead. It's the North Fork, Middle Fork, and the South Fork of the Flathead. And it goes from the Canadian line down. It kind of can talk about sometimes the wild sections are from the upper headwaters coming down. And the Act will define, the stretch of river that it's on. And it will actually classify it. And you see in that system, we'd have to have another overlay to see exactly where those wild. The wild is going to be in the wilderness, for the most part, coming out of the wilderness. And some of it's scenic, and there's the differences. They're essentially primitive and unpolluted. You can have largely undeveloped but accessible in places by roads. Or last week we talked about that recreational part of it that can actually have roads or railroads by it. And he talked about the railroad issue and talked about how threatened the river was, the Flathead, because of that railroad. A very close by river system is the Clearwater, just over in Idaho. So when you go over the top, not right at the top, but on down to the ranger station, or Powell Ranger Station, that's where the Locksaw starts. And it's going along the road, so it's going to be most likely recreational classification. But then you've got the Selway coming down out of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, and it's wild until it exits and goes along that road, and then it will become recreational. I don't think they have a scenic section. So it's kind of complicated, and we've never studied that very much. We don't know much about those rivers and differences or how people perceive those. Today on a conference call I was on, one of the river manager in Colorado was talking about the myth that the public thinks that, they don't understand this, they don't want to understand it, but it means some kind of federal control and change, and they don't like it very much. And he was introducing that to add to my list of research questions. How do you get past the myth? There's some kind of beliefs of the public about the wild and scenic river system that may not be very accurate. I hope the difficulty we had answering that scenic recreational thing tells us that we can all continue to learn, and I'm continuing to learn. This hasn't been my particular focus, but we've been studying these rivers a lot over this last year and learning a lot from these folk. So 219 miles, but it's not just a river, It's like this complex system of rivers. Okay, so now I'm going to start the main feature, building a wild and scenic river science agenda. And again, I'm doing it kind of as a proposal. We're floating it to the agencies. We're looking at both research and managers and trying to think where the gaps are in this research agenda. And we identified 2 or 3 today in a conference call with a nationwide wild and scenic rivers managers for the Forest Service. They're throwing out ideas to me today. But I want to talk about this history. And I'm not going to talk a lot about it. Like I said, every topic I might not be the best one, but people could talk about, for lectures, many lectures probably on each of these topics. But I kind of want to talk about 3 or 4 topics here that we didn't cover in that theme issue of the journal, that we're trying to blend in and think about, the ongoing role of them. And one of them is kind of geomorphology and hydrology. And all I'm going to say is there's been a lot of work on that topic. Wild and scenic rivers, the wildest rivers we have. Imagine if you're a scientist, if you're a geomorphologist, that guy right there, Luna Leopold, that's Aldo Leopold's son. How many of you read the Sand County Almanac? Okay, good. So, and if you haven't, you know who Aldo Leopold is, has some idea. There's a lot of books about him. The institute I'm at is named after him. Congress wanted to name it, and our agencies ended up naming it as a tribute to his, as a scientist, what he was doing in advocating for some wilderness remaining. Well, his son was a geomorphologist studying some of the wildest rivers in the United States, places where there weren't dams, where there wasn't development, where there weren't humans, living. And I kind of say this as kind of part of the history of wild river research, because it was so dependent on those natural rivers. And Luna wrote an article for us in 2000. I think he died in 2006. As a matter of fact, the article, the first draft he wrote, I told him I liked it. It meandered like a river. He was kind of on oxygen. He's in a hospital bed. I feel guilty about making him write that article. But I'm so glad we have that article. Go read that, and you'll have a great appreciation for these scientists that were studying geomorphology. And he talked about flying into an unnamed river in Alaska. I think Rick's been there on that river, wherever it is. But you have to read that. And imagine what he was seeing. He was waiting for his crew. He got dropped off of the equipment. The plane went back to bring the people. And he's sitting there thinking. He looks across the river, and the vertical bank some 4 meters high against which the water impinged at high flow. The top of the far bank was flat, obviously a terrace, the remnant of former floodplain. Exposed material underlying that surface was made up of gravel, some of that under my feet. These rocks must have been worked over, rounded and sorted not just by one, but by two or perhaps more glaciations during the Pleistocene. So he's sitting there by himself in the middle of nowhere, watch that plane take off to go get his crew, and he's looking and he's thinking that they're going to be spending a couple of weeks there doing whatever geomorphologists do. That's why I'm not going into any detail, because I'm not a geomorphologist or hydrologist. But he was really studying that place. But he called this article The Value of Fear, and it's so good. Because as he looked across the gravel to the bordering thicket, he wondered how long it would take a grizzly bear to cross that narrow open space. I realized then, but did not want to acknowledge it, that I was afraid, okay? He's not doing research down here on the Clark Fork or even up on the Blackfoot or even up into Bob Marshall. He's at this place really pushing it to get out to the wildest rivers and try to understand geomorphology. And these wild places that, and I'm talking the 50s, 60s here when he was probably doing his work, his initial work. But he talks about being in the Grand Canyon. He talks about a lot of rivers. Go read that article. It's fun to think about a scientist, the way he looks at things, but he's also Aldo Leopold's son. So the whole concept of wilderness is really important to him. And the topic of doing science in wilderness really had him, had a hold of him. So that's kind of a topic we've had for a while, and it's real important, and we acknowledge it. You won't find any articles in this theme issue of the journal about it. And this is where I could really get in trouble. I'm glad there's not a lot of scientists here, because I lump fish, fire, and climate. I'm just saying there's been a lot of research on fish, and particularly this guy, Russ Thoreau from the Rocky Mountain Research Station over in Idaho. He works in the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness, and what a wonderful place with all those rivers and streams and high mountain rivers, and it's just a wonderful laboratory. And we think of it that way. If you've been in the Frank Church, you may have hiked, you may have ridden horses, you may have floated, kayaked, or raft. I've done many of those things too. But when you go with Russ, you see fish. You're looking for impacts of fire, and there's several people. The fire scientists would kill me probably for just lumping and saying fish, fire, and climate. But I'm going to acknowledge, we know that that research has occurred, and it's been real important that it happens in wilderness for things like fire, where fires, big fires are allowed sometimes suppressed in the past. As they burn, let's look at the effects of woody debris and how it moves into the stream. Let's look at runoff. Let's look at erosion. Let's look what happens to fish populations. And it's been a wonderful laboratory for those big fires, and some of our big wild places, our wildernesses in the U.S., is where we have, I think we have one social scientist now in the Leopold Institute and 3 fire ecologists. That's it. We started out in 1967 as they had 2 cultural geographers, social scientists. But wilderness research is a lot about fire, and river research in these big wildernesses are a lot about fire. And Russ was talking in something just recently about these large, well-connected, high-elevation aquatic habitats. Ooh, what could that be? We've protected a lot of those places as wilderness now, wildlands. May serve as anchors for species survival, recovery, global warming. Talk about the slow pace of water temperature increases and their role as refuge for cold water biodiversity. So we know these wildernesses, these large western wildernesses particularly, and in Alaska, I would say, with climate change, really trying to understand what's happening as temperatures change in Alaska and the release of carbon from some of those areas as temperatures come up. So wilderness is a lot of scientists that their careers are studying fish populations in some of these high elevation, cold water temperature places. People are studying fire in these places and the linkage between them. And we're looking a lot at climate issues. This is our baseline that we have, the least disturbed places. So again, I'm just kind of acknowledging that we have those and not reviewing that science very much. Invasive plants is a topic that we've had research historically in wilderness kind of as a separate branch. And what's kind of interesting is that people are studying invasive plants in wilderness. There's a major invasive plant management program and the Bob Marshall and the Selway Bitterroot, were interested in it, but the avenue of entry of invasive plants along these rivers is kind of unique. So there's been a research program historically, and these guys in the Frank Church in 2001 put together an article that reviewed some of that science and trying to think, well, what's different? There's certainly hiking and horse users like you have in other places bringing invasive plant material in, but the river itself, if you know about the main fork of the Salmon, it's coming from outside the wilderness. The middle fork joins up with it, and it goes right through the wilderness, then it goes outside. Linville Gorge, the Linville River comes from outside through communities and comes inside the wilderness in North Carolina. We often have these rivers, bringing influence, and they're kind of debating the role of managers and summarizing some of that research. And are we stewards, just managers or protectors? Are we guardians or are we gardeners? So how much intervention, how much restoration, how much of that stuff should we be doing? And they reviewed that pretty good back in 2001. There isn't anyone studying that right now real intensively, but I'm sure the invasive people know that literature well. And back then, these people were concluding that, it's unique in the rivers, that we have to maintain momentum. We have to find ways through budget cuts and organization changes. If you're looking at invasive species and trying to control those, maintain natural conditions, got to maintain momentum, go from treatment. Don't think about treatment, think about restoration. So they're really playing with this idea of gardeners. What's our role? What's our duty? You'll see in a minute at least one paper in our theme issues using the term rewilding. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. I just published a paper that defined rewilding, and I found 6 different definitions. So that's another lecture we can talk about some kind, depending on what continent you're on. But that's a very popular term, and I described rewilding very simply as restoration with emotion. You're trying to restore something to the point that then it can maintain its wildness on its own after that. That's very different from just restoration or intervention type things. Maintain or strengthen a relationship with partners were important. Education awareness program had to grow beyond, really focus on those rivers and protecting them. Early detection and inventory. They talk about the Frank Church. They needed some kind of weed management area. And this is what's really important, why I made you sit through that whole list. And this is going to be consistent with some things we see later, that better coordination with weed managers outside wilderness or outside that river corridor is going to be really important. And we're going to see that a lot, that designation as a wilderness or designation as a wild river doesn't take care of invasive species problem, doesn't take care of that essentially primitive kind of directive we're trying to accomplish. And maybe the last kind of former kind of big research we've had consistently, if you've worked in river research, it's been one of these: invasives, fire, fish, climate, hydrology, geomorphology, or recreation. In the 1970s, there was a unit with the North Central Station, the Forest Service, that embarked on a new program of nationwide research on river recreation management. It's kind of like the Leopolds. We started as a Forest Service unit in 1967. They started in about 76. And boy, between 78 and 81, they surveyed 45 rivers. They were focused on rivers and recreation. I was in college about the time that they were finishing up in the early 80s, and everybody in our field wanted to be part of that. And look, I see why. That's not the Blackfoot. There's not enough coolers in the inner tubes there. But wherever that is, it was exciting. These guys, wilderness was exciting, and then here came wild and scenic rivers, and it was like they were focusing on the recreation. They said their focus was on, who's using them and how are they using them and why are they using them, and some real basic questions. But that's where we started, in wilderness, and we kind of evolved into biophysical and values and benefits and all kinds of things over the years. And the river recreation research you'd have thought would have done that too. In their last paragraph said their ultimate goal is to make it possible for recreationists like yourself, this was something I stole from a survey or something, to get the maximum enjoyment of the nation's rivers without jeopardizing the environment. I mean, they were certainly thinking about the environment, and if they would have stayed in existence beyond 1986, they certainly would have. They were zeroed out. I interviewed one of the 5 scientists in that unit the other day trying to understand what happened in 1986. Rivers. We were all excited about rivers. We had a research unit, 5 scientists in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the Forest Service just zeroed it out. Just one day just said, nope, it's not sustainable. You've answered some questions. You've started big data sets and offered those people jobs down in Chicago, I think. And they said, no. It'd be like offering me a job in Chicago, living in Missoula, Montana. You know, Chicago's great. I like pizza and stuff. But, you know, when you're focused on a particular research topic, and those guys those people, men and women, had all worked in the boundary waters before that. And then they took this national river focus. And then they told them they had to go study urban forestry. All 5 of them quit the Forest Service. Almost unheard of. You know, be like the Leopold Institute offering us a job in Chicago tomorrow. And all of a sudden, nope, I'm going to this university. I'm going to go work for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And they all dispersed. And it's one of those mysteries of life. You know, river recreation research. It just seems so important. Wilderness stuck with it, went all the way through. Something politically kind of shot it down, it seemed like. And it just got zeroed out, doesn't exist. So it certainly did. That doesn't mean river recreation research hasn't happened. People in academia, universities have done river research. I mentioned the Leopold Institute. People have come to us and said, we need some work up on the Kobuk in Alaska. We want to look at the main salmon, middle salmon, the unique tributaries of the salmon as part of the forest planning process on the Salmon Challis National Forest. And so, you know, I did several studies down there. Middle Fork Flathead, the Arctic Refuge. There's several wild rivers in the Arctic Refuge. And we've studied issues in the Arctic Refuge and looked at those rivers, as well as the Togiak up in Alaska as well. And even Kamchatka. We've been involved with the Wild Salmon Center and United Nations Development Program. And BLM funds some of that work because we think of the Asia Pacific as all one big ecosystem. That's really exciting to me, that we're thinking about Alaska and the salmon, and we're thinking about Kamchatka, the far east of Russia, and thinking about what's happening to those rivers collectively. And we've done that work. But it wasn't because any of that work was necessarily because we're a rivers research unit. It was more problem-oriented, like limits of acceptable change indicators and standards, or trying to come up with a way to establish capacity. We've done some modeling, some travel simulation modeling. We can get itineraries for people, understand how they move through the boundary waters or down a river, and we can model that to try to understand if you give permits to a certain number of groups or certain size of groups, certain days, you know, how fast they're going to move through the system, and how might we manage for the number of campsites, you know, in some places with deep canyons and things. You know, we've had planning teams come to us from, you know, the Togiak or the Middle Main Forks of the Salmon, the Frank Church group, and they may have asked us about planning issues. They may have asked us about conflict. We get involved in a lot of conflict research, not just on rivers, all over wilderness around the country. Recreation fees, how do fees influence people's decisions? Special provisions, those picture those jet boats. The Central Idaho Bill of 1980 allowed jet boats to continue to operate on the main fork of the Salmon at a level not lower than 1976 or 78. Well, finally, in the mid-90s, they started asking us, what are we going to do about that? Maybe it was 2000, that we started trying to understand how we're going to manage jet boats. It was a special provision, a legislative exception. That wilderness, wild river legislation said jet boats will continue. That's how grazing occurs. You know, commercial activities are outlawed in the Wilderness Act that says they won't occur, but we have grazing, we have commercial outfitting, there's kind of exceptions. The whole special provisions in Alaska, you might think of ANILCA, has a whole bunch of special provisions with it, and it's almost a special provision of the Wilderness Act. Got to be careful when you say that. Some people don't like that. But it does. It takes the Wilderness Act and say, we're going to make it wilderness, but we're going to do all these things. And then this piece of legislation has a whole bunch of special provisions. So we were interested in jet boats, not because it was on a river, but because it was a special provision. And we studied it, published papers. So subsistence management policies, visitor experiences, campsite impacts. David Cole, a retired scientist from the institute I worked with for almost 30 years, I guess. Except he retired a couple of years ago, so only 28 years. He studied campsite impacts on a lot of rivers. We both studied use allocation a good bit. And I think in this trip down the Smith River over there on the far side, I was rowing for the forest planner, and he had the forest supervisor in his raft, and I took a lot of pictures of him. It's so funny that we had to row these guys down the Smith River. But we had a great trip. So now I want to talk about the future, and this is kind of more of the main part for the next 20 minutes or so. I want to introduce you to some of these current research topics that appear in this International Journal of Wilderness Special Issue. And I'm going to kind of go through these. You don't need to, you're going to hear each of these right now, okay? I'm going to start with that economic benefits, and you'll see that heading on each one. I'm going to try to go through those 8 as quickly as I can. But I want to talk a little bit and talk about the community. So the economic benefits is a topic that, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act doesn't say anything about economic benefits. The Wilderness Act doesn't say anything about economic benefits. That's not the purpose of those places. It's a higher order purpose of those places that are not about economics. We often look at economics. We're interested. A lot of local communities are very interested. But Mike Bowker, there, he and his wife on the Kenai. It's nice to see these economists out on the river having fun too. And John Bergstrom and his son on the Chattooga, that dark river, or that dark movie, I'm sorry, that Tim Palmer talked about last week that he refused to see. So these economists do get out and talk. And it got a good article where they kind of try to lay out this model. And you can certainly see the Wild and Scenic River area, they hypothesize, they try to draw all the squares and lines that there's expenditures. There's businesses and private residents have expenditures, receive money. The visitors are making money, are spending money. There's concession fees. The society's allocating funding to the agency, which spends it. There's user fees involved. And they try to think through some of the economics that we should be thinking about that we might be interested. Which of these are most important? And I'm not going to talk about some of that bottom half quite yet. That's kind of the non-expenditure related. But just in expenditures, they reviewed several studies, tried to find out just how much research has been done. And it's interesting to see some of these rivers not systematically done, and that was obviously one of their conclusions. It was kind of hit and miss. A few academics, a few Forest Service people put some studies together, mostly in the east, and trying to understand how much people spent. And the one study on the Salmon River says that without the Salmon River, it's $148 per person per day. With the Salmon River, it's $441. We don't know if somebody made a mistake, if they had a bad sample, because we haven't replicated that, and we haven't done other big rivers in the West. There's just not very much economics research. And then when they look at the secondary economic impacts, what they call total industrial output, you see that those values are really different. And look at the big one back on the upper Delaware in New York. $29 million of secondary, the money turning over in the society. And that was only for 6 county regions. So sometimes it's regions. You look down at Idaho, the whole state. Wait a minute, all those expenditures, but there's not very many people. Remember how many groups per day on the Selway? There's 1 group per day. There's, I think, 7 on the Middle, 8 on the Salmon. There's benefits and economic benefits, but the actual looking at the economic impact. Now, should that influence us? People want to know this information, and there hasn't been much done, actually. They found a few studies, and they say it was piecemeal and dated. People right now aren't doing very much river economics research to help us understand. And wouldn't you love to have it by wild, scenic, and recreational? No one's doing that. No one's ever done it. Oh, that's their next conclusion, that no one's disaggregating that and thinking about those economic benefits, whether they're important to us. Maybe if some of those myths, and we looked at economic benefits of some of the recreation and scenic, it would protect them to be free-flowing. but we wouldn't lose much and maybe gain quite a bit. We don't know. And they also say that off-site benefits likely be at least as significant as on-site, but not assessed very well. Most of these river studies have focused, right on the site. As a matter of fact, they offer us them and the next author, Danielle Perry, who's going to be here March 20th, I think, be your guest lecturer. Danielle's from Northern Arizona University. Both of them were talking about the kind of thinking about these outstanding and remarkable values, thinking of them as services or benefits. And Bowker and Bergstrom threw up this little model, just trying to say that expenditures might be a very small part of that total pie. And it's not just use and non-use values. We all might value the Togiak River in Alaska, knowing that it's not dammed and free-flowing, or we might value the Missouri or the Flathead, or I think there's 50 rivers right now proposed. Tim Palmer talked about mileage. I think about rivers, segments that they're trying to protect in Montana. And there's certainly those use values related to expenditures and recreation and even domestic or other water supplies. But then there's the non-use, and I really like what I really like about their model is talking about future use and future values. That's a good model to help us try to think about what rivers, how they're valuable to us in services to society now, from use, from non-use, from future use. And actually, Danielle, in her paper in this issue, she talks about those outstanding and remarkable values that Congress told us in 1968. And that's kind of the issue. If we pass that act today, would we use that term, outstanding and remarkable values? It's kind of in a way, a simple term, a light term. She went through and looked at the rivers that have been designated. They talk about recreation, scenic, fish, wildlife, geologic, culture, history. And she analyzed those others, kind of concluding that some of the things we think as ecosystem service values, kind of ecology, water clarity, hydrology, some of the traditional uses, cultural uses, maybe have grown a lot over time. Our understanding of them, our appreciation for those values, and that what she actually proposed, this little table over here on the right, is saying that nowadays that we often think about, I don't know how familiar you are with that term, ecosystem services. It scares a lot of people away. We try to avoid it at all costs. But in science and within the agencies, we talk about them a lot. It's kind of ecological flow or flow of benefits to society or to the ecosystem. It's just another kind of way of thinking about what we call values in 1968. So these provisioning, regulating, supporting, or cultural values, we might think of the services. We've been doing work in this area, research ourselves in this area, and we can articulate a lot of ecosystem services associated with a particular river or area. And then we can look at these outstanding recreation values, outstandingly remarkable values within the different services. And what it gives us, a line of thinking that she presents, is getting us down to who benefits and actually trade-offs involved. So like the manager today was talking about the myths of designation of wild and scenic rivers, maybe we can get in and talk about those myths and think about those impacts, whether they're economic from use or non-use, or these functioning, more regulating, ecological values, the cultural values. Someone asked last week the role of indigenous people or how they interact with wild and scenic rivers. And there's several rivers that the outstanding and remarkable value is actually related to traditional cultural uses. And we think of that as a benefit to a particular section of society, that if you dam that river or use it for other purposes, there's a cost involved, something lost. So kind of a complex topic, but we're looking at that real close. And really the simple question is, if that legislation passed today, would it be as simple as outstanding and remarkable values, or would it be a more complex kind of a justification and specification of what we're trying to protect on those rivers? And how can we look at that more of a socio-political analysis and simply a simple statement of those values? So that's the question that they're raising right there, Nat, with the ecosystem services is framing the wild and scenic or outstanding remarkable values in a political economic framework. Does it help weigh trade-offs and inform decision makers? We've developed methods of highlighting trade-offs and really think of the values. But that chart we looked at a while ago on the economics had no costs. And making sure, and kind of some of the economics approach or the ecosystem services approaches are really trying to focus on not just the benefits, but the costs and trade-offs. And there's a lot of people very interested. And I hope Danielle, I'm not doing her justice, but I hope when she comes here, she'll talk about that some better. Danielle also talked about the need for better ecosystem and social representation, and we could do research on that topic. And she included this map. I don't know why Idaho only has 21. The national database says 22. But Danielle's map shows 21. But what she's showing is that Oregon, California, Idaho, Alaska, those states have a lot of wild and scenic rivers. And look at Georgia with one. Look at Kansas with none. Oklahoma with none. North Dakota, Nevada, even Virginia, have none. And really trying to think that maybe if you looked at that in a different way, like ecoregions, and think about, hey, it may be that some of those states that have one are over in a particular ecoregion that goes across political boundaries, and maybe we have several in some ecosystem ecoregions, and maybe there's some, it might be a nice way to look at it, and she's advocating and suggesting that we take a more in-depth look at the National River Inventory. There's over 3,000 rivers that could possibly be included, and really think about the ecoregions and how they fit into these ecoregions in the United States. And she kind of hints at, I pulled that map out of something else, but even thinking about it across society. And it's interesting if you look at those states with high numbers of rivers, and if you look where the I think it's the non-white, non-Hispanic population is in the United States. They're like, you're doing two diametrically opposed maps. And there's people interested in that. And it'll come up in just a minute in one of our analyses, you'll see, of thinking about how well our river system delivers services to our society. So the recreation management is always going to be an issue. And we have a paper from this group, it's an interagency group, that's the Visitor Use Management Council. And they're advocating kind of a sliding scale to determine the level of analysis needed for addressing capacity and other issues in wild and scenic rivers. So the federal agencies are working together. And I think we have Park Service, Forest Service, BLM authors on that paper. And they're saying that we need research still, we don't know where to go, to help us determine uncertainty, risk, controversy, and public interest to make decisions about how much effort to put into the planning. You understand? It might be the Clark Fork right here in town, we want to do something with that river management, and they say, oh, there's not much risk in what we're going to do. It's not very important. There's not much controversy, not much public interest. And so it's pretty easy to make a decision not to invest a lot into that decision. Whereas we go up Rock Creek or we go up other places that people have long attachments to, the Clearwater River or something here in Montana, and they might say there's a lot of uncertainty about the effects of the management, there's a lot of risk, a lot of public interest, and we need to do research to help us do that. So they lay out those needs to continue, and a bunch of other things, defining desired conditions, analyzing impacts of facilities, services, selecting indicators, things we've been doing at different places, but not on a coordinated basis or a way to generalize across areas. So the recreation research is one that people are engaged with. We've been engaged with it. There's still a lot of needs for that as part of a program. We had a couple of papers on kind of understanding the positive and negative effects of restoration through dam removal and rewatering streams. I think Tim Palmer, what did he say? There's 600 dams scheduled for removal, I think he said, or being considered. Can't remember what he said exactly about those 600 dams. I haven't seen that statistic. But how many of you were down here on the bluff with me when we restored the confluence, when they took that last dip that restored the confluence between the Blackfoot and the Clark Fork? Anybody? It was an exciting time for this community. That was a big deal to remove that dam. And it was exciting to be up there with the governor and the mayor and a bunch of other people, my daughter, and it was exciting to restore that, you know, and he talked about that happening a lot. You know, in the United States and other countries are removing some dams. And so we have a couple of papers, this one that talked about the white salmon, 4,000 visitors in 1987 to 2016 with 32,000 people floating it. There's a lot of, actually this article is calling for some management intervention. It's like the use is growing so much, and they removed the dam, and the traffic is going way up the river. Biologically, it seems great, you know, biophysical, but the social conditions and impacts of recreation users, they're trying to figure out what the impacts of removing that dam. They weren't as prepared as they would have liked to be, and they didn't understand what was going to happen. An even better example of not knowing what was happening, I don't know if you ever heard of Fossil Creek down in Arizona, but Bjorn and Kelly talked about this beautiful place that's attracting a lot of use out of Phoenix right now. But it, like 1908 or something, it was diverted. 90% of the water was diverted for mining purposes. Eventually it was picked up and piped into Phoenix, I think, for domestic water. And they decommissioned that dam, and it got designated a wild and scenic river. It was like decommissioned in, I don't know if anybody knows, 2006. 2009, it became a wild and scenic river. It was just such a great place. It connected some water coming through wilderness with another wilderness maybe. And he said that from biophysical, population increases of 17-fold, 52-fold, 70-fold, and 150-fold on fish and aquatics. That they were, you know, really restoring the biophysical environment tremendously. But they didn't anticipate the recreation use that grew there. And in 2009, they had like 49%, no, 19% in 2009 was Hispanic, and 49% in 2013. It's unheard of. The Forest Service likes it. Remember that demographic map we were looking at a while ago? So serving minority populations, urban populations, the Forest Service likes that a lot. They feel like that's part of their program. But this particular river, among the outstandingly remarkable values, was an Apache group and a Yavapai, is that right? Group that had historical uses of that river, and those were among the outstandingly remarkable values besides recreation and fisheries. And all of a sudden you got this mass people coming out of Phoenix in there, and use just exploded. And they had to move towards controlling that recreation use. And they actually, their summary talks about, it stands to reason that rivers with dams or other developments that are unsafe, no longer useful, or inefficiently providing tangible commodity-based services are ripe for public discourse about their relative value in a free-flowing state. And that's certainly what Tim was advocating last week, particularly where potential exists for the restoration, enhancement, or creation of new outstandingly remarkable values. We've got to really think about that in this dam removal. I think it's an exciting area of research and trying to think what we should be measuring, what should we be monitoring, what kind of management solutions do we need to have in place, and you're going to see that in just a minute. So they laid out a whole bunch of questions. I won't go through those, but a lot of questions that can be answered by research. And we really need that right now with this rewatering or restoration, you know, dam removal. And this was the article they used rewilding. They tried to review that literature and think of it as a rewilding process. But you can't just walk away from it. The recreation use increases so much that managers have to stay involved. We can't just let it go, let it return to a free-willed ecosystem very easily. Just last couple. One was about aquatic diversity, and I chose an example. They had a couple of case studies, one in the Frank Church and one in Puerto Rico. And I thought it was interesting because the mile segments, you saw the flathead here, they're 1.9, 3.9, 5.9. I mean, small rivers in Puerto Rico, but among the only rivers that are not dammed or not, controlled in some way. And this woman there in the middle, we were actually conversing with her right after that hurricane down there, hurricane, I guess. And she was living at the office because she didn't have any water or electricity. They had a generator going at the office. It really brought that whole situation down in Puerto Rico home when we're working with a scientist that's sending us maps and editing our paper and interacting with us over her own cell phone because there was no telephone service there at the Institute of Tropical Forestry and there in Puerto Rico. But their main point, very simply, is to conserve biodiversity. Yeah, designation is important, but it's not enough, and we focused on that. I think that's what the conservationists focus on, is that let's get these designated. We got 50 rivers, we got 3,000 miles, we've got to get designation. But what they're saying is aquatic restoration efforts, in-stream flow provision, adoption of more ecologically compatible land use policies on adjacent lands, look in larger systems. And we have the science to do that now. That maybe the way we've allocated these rivers has not benefited aquatic systems as much as they could have. So let's go back and think about dam removal. Let's think about invasive plants. Let's think about the whole, all the topics we've been talking about. And these aquatic biologists are really getting us thinking about systems, ecology, and not just designation, that these adjacent lands are going to be really important. Restoration, again, what's our role? Are we guardians? Are we gardeners? And thinking that through. So a really good article. And this article got the Forest Service Chiefs Award this year for wilderness science, mostly because there isn't an award for wild and scenic river science. I don't know why, but there is one for wilderness. So a lot of that research has been done in wilderness. And I think this wild section, the blue section there, it's 3.9 miles. I think that's in a wilderness on the El Yunque National Forest. So there is a wild section even of that river. The other one that's very close to this that we really like, that'll appear in the March issue of the journal, my friend Zdenka Chernova from Charles University in Prague, Czech Republic. And she works on the Vltava River. Who can say that better than me? Anybody know? Anybody ever been on the Vltava River? You been in Prague? Flows right through Prague? Anybody? So I don't know how you pronounce that, V-L-T-A-V-A. But there's classic music written about that river. I mean, it's a really important river, and it rises right up on the boundary of the Czech Republic and Germany. Czech Republic and Germany. There's a place there they call the Wild Heart of Europe, about 33,000 acres right on the former Iron Curtain. There's no houses, there's no roads, because it was the Iron Curtain, the separation between Czech Republic and Germany. Now you can walk back and forth across it. There's just remnants. You can see the line from up on top of the mountains. So it's an amazing place, and it's wild, and they're protecting it as wilderness or non-intervention, and it gives rise to this river. The problem with this river is that use has increased because it's protected. The area it flows through is protected. That actually has attracted people. So recreation use, I've got a chart here in just a minute. I think it's right here. Recreation use just exploded there in 2001, 2002, 2003, right when they're debating and going through this process 10 years ago, almost 20 years ago, of protecting this kind of post-Iron Curtain place that had been protected from development, offered all kinds of science and educational values. And this river flowing through it was attracting a lot of recreation use when they found out it had a seriously, I'll say rare, not threatened, pearl mussel that existed there. And research was showing that at certain levels of flow, the recreation use was having an impact. They felt pretty conclusively that recreation use was, people were dragging boats across some places, they were wading in places, because of the river flow. And they actually found a way to put some use limits into place. That's why that dropped off. It wasn't because people quit, lost their interest. But they did it with research on the pearl mussels, kind of aquatic diversity issues, and asking the recreationists about what the policy should be, given that the use numbers were interacting at low levels with those pearl mussels. So actually, there's probably some day when the river flow is high that it's real crowded and there's a lot of people there. And there's some day at a certain level of flow that there's no recreation use. So it averages out a lower level, and it's kind of, it bounced way down, but they're really looking at public opinion about that and getting the public and local communities involved. In this wild heart of Europe, it's interesting, a lot of people have felt in Europe that the protected areas designating wilderness or wildness is actually a threat to biodiversity. And they're trying to show that they can manage those things together and accomplish a lot of things. And it's a real promising story out of the Czech Republic. You can read about it coming up in the March issue. So, simple question to identify the risks and threats for native aquatic species and their habitats, and in this case, certainly development, but also the recreation, was a threat to those things. So there's no roads there, but the recreation itself was growing so high. And then they say, can designation protect these species by addressing all these effects? No, not designation by itself. It's not going to accomplish, these things to control these effects. They have to think in larger systems, and they're really interested in thinking of wild, scenic, and recreational. How do those implications? I mean, we heard last week about the railroad. It has implications for aquatic diversity. What do we do in managing that railroad, which is allowed by law, to protect aquatic diversity along that part of the river? So just the last couple of things are more international. And one is, we have an article coming out in March, April, that we actually went to some geographers at the University of Leeds in the UK and asked them to do an assessment worldwide to figure out where the 10% wildest rivers are. And so they went through, I think it had been done by hand in the mid to late 1980s by Michael McCloskey, who was the president of the Sierra Club. And he put some data together from existing maps. But we've got a lot of secondary data available to us right now. And we wanted to see how good that data was. And if you're into GIS or remote sensing kind of things, footprint type of analysis, you ought to read that paper. It's a very applied paper, but he's going in and trying to come up with some attributes of the catchments themselves. Australia had done that. Their wild scenic river system had actually classified the catchments from extremely primitive or pristine to developed, and they classified all the rivers in Australia and chose those ones to protect that were kind of a combination of the wildest and the ones that were threatened. So he did this for the world, and we did this just for this journal that's coming out, and he did it continent by continent and trying to think of where the 10% wildest, the least impacted catchments, there aren't dams, there aren't development, that 10% highest, most pristine places in the world. And it's a good place to start that analysis, look continent by continent. And in their questions, we asked everyone, to identify some researchable questions. So what are the implications of most of the wildest rivers following mainly into permafrost or desert environments? So when we look at the 10%, we have a lot of them where people don't live, don't travel. It kind of makes sense. So what did we learn from that? Maybe we should be looking at the next 10%, or maybe there's other attributes that we want to think about. We're certainly not talking about distribution to society by those 10% if we tried to campaign internationally to do those. But there's certainly a lot of existence values. It's like the Arctic Refuge. A lot of people really value the Arctic Refuge, whether you've never been there, whether you've been there or not. Just knowing that wild place exists and why it exists. So they also say the global data sets are real inconsistent. The coarse scale, relying on highly generalized data sources, and how do we improve them. And that's great. We've identified, we've shown what we can do with it, and now we're trying to think, what do we do next? And actually, we have a World Wilderness Congress in China in 2019 that's going to be heavily, there's going to be a branch specifically of that Congress internationally focused on wild rivers around the world. These guys have another year and a half to keep perfecting this and looking for more data and trying to beef that up and help us understand, how should we be looking at these large data sets, and do we care? Why do we care internationally about the condition of these rivers and how they're threatened? The country scale is best, most consistent when they can do countries. Continents are difficult still. Country-to-country comparisons are difficult. Definitions of catchment boundaries were questionable, and they need more national and local assessment. So really thinking condition rivers nationally, it's a very difficult thing to do. We got some people trying to do it, and look at that paper. Most people would find that interesting. It's a pretty simple explanation of those data sets and what we have and where those rivers are and just how protected they are. Then the last thing I have, we have a paper by a Chinese scientist there that's really proposing in China this some kind of a protected river system. And it's real intriguing because, for one, as a country, as a culture, as a society, they've not lived through our 1960s. Think about it. What did they live through? A lot of turmoil, a lot of really challenging things, not focused on the environment. In Tiananmen Square, what happened? Before your time too, probably, most of you. A lot of young Chinese people don't know what happened in Tiananmen Square. They ask them and they don't know, they don't really understand it. But they basically, young people, my wife is from China, and she was a college student at that time. When was that? Late 80s, I think. Is that right? Yeah, late 80, 88, 89. She was a college student, and they were demanding more freedom. They were looking at our rights movements and voting rights, minority rights, animal rights, civil rights. I mean, you name it. Environmental concern. They really wanted more say, and there was a confrontation between the military, the government, and society, and they offered them a decision. Do you want to do that, or do you want to focus on quality of life and economic kind of progress? And that's what they did. They chose that way. They went that direction to define their quality of life. And it's hard to bring that back. Right now, President Xi talks a lot about promoting ecological progress. There's a lot of awareness internationally of environmental issues. And again, we can't put it into that rights decade that we went through. They don't have a Mike Mansfield. They don't have a Congress united. They don't have people speaking for the people. It's governed in a very different way. But right now is a real prime time in China. And in the article, Li Peng lays out all the things that's happening in China that's very positive towards kind of increased protection. They're trying to get national parks for the first time. They've got places they call national parks. In the IUCN, the International Union of Conservation Nature category, they're category 5, not category 2. They don't fit the nature protection purpose of national parks. They fit more the economic development purpose. So right now they're trying to develop category 2 national parks. They got 5 or 6 areas in China that they're going to manage for those values. And wild rivers they're proposing. And I'll be over there next month. We're looking at one particular river in Sichuan province, and the challenges are to think about, they love our system. They love our system, the academics and the water ministry people. But outstanding or remarkable values? Wait a minute. Should we do that, or should we talk about ecosystem services, or should we talk about ecological flow? What's the right way? Right now, our scientists are suggesting that we might want to look more complex at it over there. So what are the threats to those, potential boundaries? What have we learned over here? So our international programs office and our science office, some of our managers were quite involved over in China right now, looking at those possibilities in places like this. So the questions, how do we make those recommendations for the right boundaries? should we be this outstanding, remarkable values? They love it because they don't have it. They've never had that discussion. But our scientists are saying, well, maybe there's something better. Or maybe you house those within a larger socio-political ecoregion, sociodemographics. There's other ways we should be looking at why we want to protect a river, what the boundaries of that river are, what kind of benefits come from it, not just think about, what you can see, but maybe there's, I read something lately that, I think it was on the Flathead, that they would, or maybe Tim said that they would go along and it's wherever you can see from the river, would be the boundary, So visual, what does that have to do with anything, when you start thinking about ecology and botany and flow of benefits? What are the primary threats and how do we assess that? What's the best management approaches? What are the designated options? How do we incorporate local communities? Because economics, it's like I worked on a panel a few years ago with Mexico and Canada. And it was on ecosystem service issues, water-based ecosystem services. And we just constantly found ourselves realizing that we had two developed countries and a developing country. And in Mexico, they haven't lived through the 60s either. And the way they manage public lands, there has to be an economic benefit to the rural people who live there. And they look at it completely different than the US and Canada does. And so you have to stop, go back culturally, go back politically, policy, and think about that. And we know that local communities, want economic benefit, are still thinking that way, but some of them are rising up and wanting more ecological protection. So it's really all the presentation. I'll just say that what we're wondering right now with almost 500 named rivers and tributaries as part of those 208 pieces of legislation in the U.S. As we move forward, as we think about those areas, we don't know how they're managed right now. We don't have much information about them. Go on the national database for the Wild and Scenic River System and you can get a little bit of information about them. I pulled up the plan for the Flathead, and they're redoing it now. It doesn't even have a date on it, doesn't have an author. I think it was done in the maybe late 70s, early 80s, but I don't know for sure on the Flathead. There's just not much information that we have. We're not assembling that information. We're not thinking about it. We're not thinking about benefits, how we should be managed, the difference between wild, scenic, and recreational implications. And I guess my concluding question, and I'd offer any three of those, is if anything has sparked your interest tonight, I'd be curious what it is. What would be your favorite research topic of those I went through? How important is this science for the future? And what other science did I not talk about? Given I talk about some historic things we've done, I talk about several, 8 new topics. And I have to tell you that, being a river scientist, the view from your office is pretty nice. The sleeping accommodations ain't bad. Anybody spent the night on the Selway River? It's a beautiful place. Launched on the Middle Fork. There's where the Middle Fork runs into the Main. And, I'd be curious your response to the science. I've given you a completely different topic and set of comments than what Tim did on conservation and activism. It's more the emotional side, and I have to come over and talk about the science side and a lot of charts, and I'm more likely to present a map or a chart than I am pictures of rivers that he gave you so many great pictures last week. So with that, I'm open to questions or comments. I particularly like to hear what kind of science interests you. Or gaps. Okay, yeah?
Since the Department of Interior is talking about rearranging the regions into watersheds, what impact will that have, pro or con, on science and the way you conduct research?
Yeah. Well, I don't know exactly what those new boundaries are. I've heard a little bit about it. I think politically, I know there's some backlash. You start moving offices or something. It's hard to understand why some of the offices and the regions are located the way they were. If you look at Danielle Perry's paper, I think, where she had those states and talked about, how thinking about Wild and Scenic Rivers by states, by those political boundaries, don't mean much. And my guess is that a lot of science or benefits or issues, problems, if we focus, and we focus I'm in the Forest Service mostly, we focus by those regions. And that ecoregion map shows there's a lot of variation in elevation, aspect, urban, non-urban. There's so many variations that she looked at all the possibilities and went to that EPA map for the purpose of this type of research as being the one that we all ought to get behind. Something like a Park Service reorganization. Is that what it was? Just the Park Service, not other interior? Across interior.
If the research has been done like state focused, then they change it to watershed.
Yeah.
The comparisons between previous and be interesting.
Yeah, the obvious thing I think about is one time I was at Olanka Research Station in Finland. I don't know how I went there. It must be my mind's traveling. But I was on a river, and Russia was right across the river. And the woman at this park in Olanka was talking about this one particular plant. And I said, well, what's its condition? What's its status over there? You point right there. She goes, we have no idea. And that was so interesting to me to think that, because of that political boundary, we're talking science, and we don't know whether this plant exists over there or not, right across the river. And I guess, we do run into some examples where science might be funded out of a region or focused right now. I do a lot of work in Alaska. Alaska is a region, for all the agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, Forest Service. It's a region by itself. And we do research there because there's a lot of political implications for that. But there's other places that even a state boundary could be a region boundary. County boundaries don't influence us very much. But those administrative boundaries, the sharing of information, my guess is there's going to be a lot of data crunching and trying to figure things out with a different organization and find a lot of data gaps, like they did in Finland to Russia. All of a sudden we got a region that even Steve was talking about internationally. There was some of those big blank places that we don't have data for. Regions have approached things different in the type of information, the priority of information. It's going to be pretty challenging. Do you know more? Do you have an opinion or some perception of what the influences might be?
No, but I think it's going to be very interesting. It makes a lot of sense to do watersheds, but that's not the history of how we've studied anything. Really.
Well, we wish that a lot of wildernesses were organized by, watersheds, and they weren't. It was more political or what's feasible, recreational interests and things like that. The logic that we would apply today isn't the logic we applied back then necessarily. So in a way, as a scientist, that transfer is real intriguing to see what does happen in terms of data gaps, or you counted it in meters and we had it in feet, I mean, there's going to be a lot of that, I imagine. Even, you think, within one agency, but, Forest Service is real decentralized. Park Service is more centralized, but there's still going to be differences across those political boundaries. But we'll yet to see. Okay, anything else?
One more question?
Yeah.
It's sort of along the same lines, but I'm curious as to whether or not there's any community scale collaboration that's already happening among communities along certain watersheds that do cross state boundaries.
Yeah, you know what across state boundaries, you added that right to last. Let me think about that. It was interesting that Tim talked about last week, and we've seen a lot, that Park Service evaluated their own management. They gave themselves, what did he say, a C or something, and he gave the ones that involved communities that, you know, real high, those kind of sharing activities have done a lot better. And I guess you might think that, you know, community involvement and buy-in, ownership, those kind of things seem to pay off. We did that jet boat study on the main fork of the Salmon years ago, and we did too good a job. The jet boat people liked us too well. They started giving our names to snowmobilers and others because we listened to them. And you know what they said was, in management of jet boats on the main fork of the Salmon, that particular community group is Western Whitewater out of Boise, was saying that, you know, we want good articulation of our relationship with that river and our use and the meanings we attach to that river, not what it says in the Central Idaho Bill of 1980, not what the managers say, but we want to make sure you hear what we're saying. And it may be that we end up losing something because what we want isn't exactly what the legislation said, but at least people will acknowledge that we lost it. And they really like that idea, you know, having that voice, having that ownership. And actually, probably the only time in my 30 years career here, forest supervisor called us, getting ready to go to a public meeting, had read our research and said, I finally understand those jet boaters now. You know, I understand them. I can read your report and understand, you know, what they get out of that experience, how they define it, what they think management should do. We're not going to do all those things, you know, but some of them we can talk about. They're concerned about safety. We didn't understand that, you know, that our use allocation affected their perception of safety or something else. So I guess just in general, where those collaboratives are involved, you know, people keep asking us to do more research on those, and we haven't done very much. We've partnered with a lot of groups, from American Alpine Club up in Denali to this Western Whitewater. I got to tell you that when those people, those jet boaters, wanted us to do research with them, they asked what it would take. And I kind of made this motion. And they go, you want us to give you money? I go, yeah. I go, they said, well, there's two problems with that. One, you're with the federal government. These jet boaters are going to give the federal government money. Number two, you're from Missoula. I don't know what they think about us down there. A bunch of tree huggers, I guess. But they gave us money, and the forest, you know, matched it. And those kind of partnerships, we work with the International Llama Association. So again, I'm not the activist, the conservation advocate. I'm advocating for science to help make decisions, and we partner with International Llama Association, understand llama and llama impacts, the Western Whitewater, American Alpine Club, Backcountry Horsemen. You know, we worked with a lot of those in research, and that's an enjoyable part of my job, to get their buy-in and support of developing the knowledge. And I hear a lot that on the management side, it's the same thing. So those collaboratives can move you from a C to a B or an A, whatever he said, and that's very rewarding. So thank you. Stop now.